Item. SCP-747. Object Class. Euclid. Special Containment Procedures. All instances of SCP-747 are to be contained in a room exactly 30 meters by 10 meters, with walls consisting of concrete 15 centimeters thick. All instances of SCP-747 are to be contained together in the same room. In the occurrence SCP-747 shows interest in any personnel, procedure SCP-747-B9 must be performed immediately. Under no circumstances shall any unusual actions of SCP-747 go unreported to personnel level 3 or higher. SCP-747 is allowed a total of 25 dolls, excluding any created under SCP-747's influence. Any personnel that begin to show visible signs of SCP-747's influence are to be contained separately in similar conditions. Should a containment breach occur, Task Force 747-B8 is to be alerted and proceed with recapture immediately. Only under extreme circumstances are any personnel with clearance level 3 or higher to have any direct contact with SCP-747. Description: SCP-747 is a phenomenon involving the appearance of children in any manner of animal masks. All instances of SCP-747 have been successfully identified as deceased children of appearance congruent with the time of death, excluding the masks. The commonality of the children, according to research, is that they all owned a doll precious to them at their time of death. Currently in containment there are 7 instances of SCP-747. SCP-747-01 is a male, approximately 7 years of age, wearing a zebra mask and a set of blue pajamas. SCP-747-02 is a male, approximately 12 years of age, wearing a mouse mask and swimming trunks. SCP-747-03 is a female, approximately 10 years of age, wearing a pig mask and an outfit typical of private schooling. SCP-747-04 is a male, approximately 14 years of age, wearing a rabbit mask and a winter coat. SCP-747-05 is a female, approximately 12 years of age, wearing a giraffe mask and a striped sari. SCP-747-06 is a female, approximately 5 years of age, wearing a goat mask and a bright pink dress typical of a beauty pageant. SCP-747-07 is a male, approximately 9 years of age, wearing a cat mask and blue overalls. SCP-747-07 was also recovered with a Note 1 which has since been separately stored. Each instance of SCP-747 cannot speak, nor do they seem to be aware of humans unless taking particular interest in specific individuals. Mainly, SCP-747 shows interest in handmade dolls and each other. It is unknown if SCP-747 has sentience, though they appear to be aware of their surroundings and will avoid walking into obstacles. SCP-747 is able to move through obstacles no thicker than 10 centimeters with ease. SCP-747 is also semi-corporeal. Instances are able to lift and touch objects, but only for short periods of time before they tire. SCP-747 has the ability to transform humans into dolls over the course of approximately 21 days. To do this, instances of SCP-747 surround the human and hold hands before walking around the human for a period of 5 to 7 seconds. Afterwards, SCP-747 disperses and continues normal behavior. It is unknown which humans they choose to transform or why. SCP-747 occasionally shows interest in a person before attempting to transform them. The person is able to interrupt the process by moving away or avoiding SCP-747. However, most people describe a feeling of thoughtlessness or blankness when in contact with SCP-747, thereby making the interruption difficult. After interaction with SCP-747, there are no immediate symptoms. There is currently no cure or treatment for the conversion process. Within 15 minutes, the target will experience numbness of the tips of extremities, similar to that caused by cold. Afterwards, over a period of approximately 21 days, the symptoms will progressively worsen. The process will accelerate under stress or panic to a minimum of 10 days. The conversion has been divided roughly into three stages, beginning from initial influence to the transformation into a doll. If at any point a doll made from SCP-747's influence is destroyed, SCP-747 will begin to show a greater interest in humans until another human is targeted for replacement.